Those who say Ukraine's offensive is going too slow almost always have a poor understanding of the nature of modern warfare, or lack a real appreciation for the difficulty of reclaiming lost territory. Despite Ukraine's undeniable military competency, they've been unable to push Russian forces out of their territory thus far. But why? At a recent ceremony paying tribute to the memory of fallen Ukrainian soldiers, President Volodymyr Zelensky encouraged optimism and unity, even as an undeniable feeling of solemnity swept over the procession. It was Ukraine's Day of Defenders, and as he reflected on the sacrifices which had saved his country from complete collapse, Zelensky reaffirmed his belief that victory would come. Plenty of pessimistic armchair generals around the world are casting their lots in disagreement of late, with Ukraine's counteroffensive struggling to move the needle, US aid slowing to a trickle, and notoriously pro-Russian candidates winning elections in neighboring countries like Slovakia. Optimism has certainly faded. These are tough times for the Ukrainian people. They are in a dogfight for their very lives, and so much of their future is out of their control. Still, we can emphatically stress that despite these setbacks, Ukraine is still winning the war. Sure, there hasn't been a simple or clear path to victory, but nothing in war, as Clausewitz famously said, is easy or simple, especially when you are the underdog. The Ukrainian armed forces have set some incredibly high standards for themselves over the past year. Some argue they are not living up to these standards in light of the equipment and training they've received. In today's video, our military experts explain why that is an unfair claim. Ukrainian forces began laying the foundations of their ongoing military offensive last winter, a period corresponding with a marked decrease in operational tempo, as Ukrainian forces absorbed what was, in hindsight, an incredibly poor attempt by Russia to reclaim the initiative. This calculation, to sit back and prepare, was a necessary risk. The fact that Russia visibly struggled to retake the city of Bakhmut in this period reinforces the difficulty of conducting offensive operations against well-entrenched defenders. Ultimately, it cost them over 50,000 soldiers to do so, a staggering number given the fact their objective was largely devoid of strategic or political value. Yes, Ukraine was pushed out of Bakhmut, but they bled Putin dry in the process, with most analysts in agreement that Ukraine inflicted 5 Russian casualties for every one of their own. In the end, rabid Russian bloggers finally got a tidbit of positive propaganda to send to the folks back home. As one commentator aptly put it, though one could now make the argument that Bakhmut has now the largest reserve of sunflower fertilizer in the world in the wake of the bloody winter of fighting to take it, Russian troops faced significant difficulties attempting to attack during the winter. They were unprepared for offensive action, relying on mercenaries rather than outfitting their own forces with the winter clothing and equipment they needed to thrive on the frozen battlefield. Hypothermia was a big threat for Russian troops, as Ukraine's 3D-printed munition-porting drones drifted lazily overhead. You could see many Russian soldiers moving lethargically even as grenades fell into their foxholes, unable to escape the blast, a sign they were already falling victim to the harsh conditions before the threat of imminent death could register. When you can barely keep fresh conscripts warm or fed and struggle to keep vehicles operating at the tail end of your supply lines, maneuver warfare on prepared defensive positions becomes next to impossible. We now know why Russia could barely move the needle last winter. There was no chance Mobics or mercenaries alike would ever be able to conduct meaningful combined arms operations when you factor in the lack of experience for the former and the lack of trust in the latter. So, what was Putin to do? When cruelty supplants logic, you get Russia's shameless human wave attacks, sending clearly expendable conscripts into the breach in clear view of Ukrainian artillery observers and drones. One Atlantic Council study revealed how, as this offensive tactic became mainstream, catastrophic losses threatened to undermine morale within the ranks of Putin's invading army. It certainly revealed a lack of military options, after a year of embarrassing battlefield setbacks, highlighting the lack of available armored fighting vehicles, which would have at least offered marginally better protection than what most Russians got. That is, if the Russians knew how to employ them properly. All evidence thus far points to the contrary. Case in point, the attempt to take the town of Vuhledar around the same time, where Russian forces wrote off 25 main battle tanks to Ukrainian mines and artillery fire. In the pandemonium, Wagner, Patriot PMC, and Russian forces suffered a catastrophic loss of communication, which resulted in the destruction of hundreds more armored vehicles. Even Russia knew these types of losses weren't sustainable. Well aware that many Ukrainian forces had been withdrawn into Europe for intensive combined arms training on new Western weapons platforms, they knew they'd have to brace for a coming spring counteroffensive. And so the Russians did the one thing they were still competent at, using bulldozers and excavators to build an interlocking network of tiered defenses, including miles upon miles of minefields, command bunkers, tank traps, dragon's teeth, barbed wire, and of course, trenches. Each barrier offered multiple fallback trenches, enabling retreating defenders to lure attackers into successive kill zones. Artillery was massed to repel attackers at strategically designated choke points. Helicopters were used to target onrushing Ukrainian AFVs. The best Russian troops were tactically withheld as mobile reserves until Ukraine revealed its true axis of attack. Given as much as a year to prepare in some places, you can imagine how serious these defenses, considered the largest defensive fortifications since World War II, actually are. Unsurprisingly, some of Russia's most notable fighting came in the earliest days of Ukraine's current summer counteroffensive, as well-equipped defenders caught initial Ukrainian mechanized convoys in the opening phases of probing these defenses, destroying and damaging many of their new Western vehicles in the process. For the past few months, Russia has been fighting from prepared positions, from which they were fully anticipating Ukrainian counterattacks. Last time the Russians did this in the Donbass, the war stretched on for 8 years between 2014 and 2022. Ukraine never veiled its intentions of achieving a breakthrough somewhere along the front at a time and place of their choosing this summer. To succeed, they needed a steady flow of Western aid and supplies, which, as both a credit to and an indictment of Western governments, they ultimately received, though not on the timetable Ukraine yearned for. Ukraine then needed to ensure their Western benefactors that they could be trusted with this equipment, which meant training on the new platforms to rehearse their intended use cases in eastern Ukraine. As part of this, they had to make sure they could mass the requisite force in reserve to exploit any breakthrough. This introduces another problem Ukraine has been facing. As any good soldier will tell you, there is a 3-to-1 rule at play when you are trying to penetrate a prepared defensive position. You need 3 times more attackers and equipment to beat an entrenched defender, and that is where Ukraine still struggles. As a far smaller nation with a fraction of the GDP Russia once enjoyed, it cannot afford to sustain the incredible human losses Russia apparently barely bats an eye at if it hopes to emerge victorious. The style of fighting Ukraine is trying to become proficient at, Western combined arms warfare, requires both manpower, materiel, professionalism, and technical aptitude. And if Ukraine wantonly throws away its trained forces into the meat grinder, it will take months to train up replacements on newly integrated armored vehicles, counter-battery radars, and engineering vehicles in their stead. As long as they are on the defensive, Russia does not have this problem. The problem they do have is the fact they are still losing about 3 times as many troops as Ukraine while on the defensive. While they have admittedly knocked out roughly half of the US-delivered Bradley infantry fighting vehicles over the course of the offensive, another problem is that the vast majority of these vehicles not only survive long enough to be pulled back and repaired, but that, contrary to most crews in Russian armored vehicles, the Ukrainian crews survive. CBS News foreign correspondent Holly Williams witnessed this firsthand on a recent tour of the front lines. In an interview with Serhiy Gavrilyuk, a Bradley crew member, he mentioned how simply driving the American-made vehicle into combat struck fear into the enemy. "It scares them," he said. "When we hear their radio and they hear that Bradley coming, they start to run away." Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, ex-commander of the US Army in Europe, said this reaction makes sense. If you go back to the Cold War, the United States realized that if we were in a conflict with the Soviet Union, we were going to be grossly outnumbered. And so the whole concept was fight outnumbered and win. And the only way you can do that is if you've got longer range. You're able to hit a Soviet tank before it even sees you. Yes, that was the logic behind the Bradley's Cold War creation, facing an enemy whose manpower vastly exceeded that of the Americans. Today, the Ukrainian forces operate under the same conditions, which is why the Bradleys have been so critical. Improved survivability offered by Western vehicles enables Ukrainian crews who have been in a firefight to continue fighting in new vehicles, while Russia is forced to inject green conscripts with inadequate training to do the same. Here's another issue. While the Ukrainian front is massive, said to be the distance between Washington, D.C. and Atlanta, it also isn't. In World War II, the Allies had to contend with massive oceans and vast distances when planning their offensive against the Axis. In a way, this played into their hands for a time. Germany, for example, didn't know whether an invasion was coming across the English Channel, down in North Africa, or somewhere else in the Balkans. With no satellites, drones, or high-altitude aerial reconnaissance, it was far easier to veil one's intentions and achieve surprise. The problem with Ukraine's offensive is that their intentions have been telegraphed from the very beginning. If it wants to expel Russia from the east, everyone knows what they have to do. They have to sever the Kerch Bridge supply route into Crimea and sever the overland supply routes into occupied southeastern Ukraine. The first objective would not only boost morale as a serious propaganda victory, it would severely limit Russian offensive capabilities in and beyond Crimea. The Kerch Bridge is the lifeline for all Russian forces in the region. Previous Ukrainian attacks with sea drones and other munitions have caused temporary shutdowns, but could not permanently damage the structure. Crimea remains a valuable military asset for Putin. It is essentially an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a base from which he is able to launch cruise missiles, airstrikes, and other ballistic missiles from naval vessels moored at the port of Sevastopol, or if he pleases, rest and resupply frontline forces. Short of permanently destroying the Kerch Bridge and staging an audacious amphibious assault for which Ukraine lacks the requisite materiel, it looks like Crimea will remain in Russian hands for the foreseeable future. The lack of military options here ultimately made it even more likely for Ukraine to target the second alternative, the overland supply routes to southeastern Ukraine. Railway lines along the Sea of Azov have been sustaining Russian defenders for over a year now. They are also responsible for part of the inflow of supplies into Crimea. Ukraine knows that virtually everything south of Mariupol relies on overland supply routes to subsist. So if Ukraine wants to inflict the most damage on Russia's southern war effort, the furthest from its bases in Russian territory, it would need to target the roads coming and going from Mariupol and Melitopol. Several weeks ago, Ukraine confirmed that it had succeeded in breaking the first line of Russian defenses. But looking at any map of Russia's prepared defensive network, you begin to see the scale of the problem. While Russia has proven its utter incompetence in this war, even they know that Ukraine is trying to get to either Mariupol or Melitopol. This is why the current offensive has not achieved the same outcome as the Fall 22 operations in Kharkiv and Kherson, even though it has achieved notable successes in other areas. The Fall 22 offensives had been completely and thoroughly veiled in secrecy. Russia had no idea when and where the breakthrough would come. Conferring with American intelligence officers and other officials, plans were amended to capitalize on Russia's weak ISR capabilities and maximize the momentum which would come. Nobody, not Putin, not anyone outside of a select body of Western and Ukrainian officials, predicted that the first attacks would come at Kharkiv. Reinforcing the Kherson axis where the initial blow did come, Russia and the world soon realized that the true left hook was thrown in the north. The defenses around Kharkiv were weak enough that thousands of onrushing vehicles and soldiers could exploit and overrun them. Uncharacteristically, Russia seems to have learned from this glaring strategic mistake. The current offensive has been significantly less successful than the prior in retaking lost ground. But unlike the 2022 offensive, Russia was not deceived as to where the attack would unfold. Since Ukraine needed time to receive new vehicles and training, Russia made the most of it, virtually fortifying the entire front. Unlike the Kharkiv and Kherson attacks, this time Russia made sure the Ukrainians would have to inch through vast minefields sown with thousands of mines. This time, Russia would engineer a front which would essentially strip Ukraine of the token advantage it had taken into the previous counteroffensive, mobility and combined arms maneuver warfare. Ukraine has had to settle on slowly and methodically taking its objectives, then trying to reclaim territory with wave after wave of human meat shields. Russia has the numbers to do this, but it lacks the will to exploit tactical gains into strategic victories. Most recently, on October 9th, it mounted a localized counteroffensive of its own near Avdiivka in the Donetsk Oblast and Orikhiv in western Zaporizhia Oblast in an attempt to draw Ukraine away from its gains in the Robotyne area. 3 Russian battalions participated, driving forward with convoys of armored vehicles and trucks supported by airstrikes and artillery barrages. The attack went as expected, attempting to encircle Avdiivka, one of the most heavily fortified areas of the Donetsk Oblast front line, a task for which military analysts argued would require far more military forces than Russia actually committed. Video surfaced of vast columns of vehicles knocked out by Ukrainian artillery. Limited offensives like these are indicative of 2 things. 1. that Putin and his generals sense the importance of pinning down Ukrainian reserves so they cannot penetrate critical areas on the front in the Zaporizhia Oblast, perhaps even a sign that the Ukrainian offensive is still grinding forward, and 2, that it has learned that it needs to stage spoiling attacks like these if it's to hope to stop Ukraine altogether. As things stand, Russia is running out of options, according to Colonel Seth Krumrich, vice president at a global security consultancy. If I were Russia today, I would punch, because the Ukrainians are going to find a breach, and they're going to punch through it. Removing pressure on itself by staging limited offensives may be the only way to delay the Ukrainians until winter itself arrives. Ukraine, for its part, has claimed that it may be able to maintain its momentum through the winter. If the cold weather hits immediately, noted Ukraine's Eastern Forces spokesman, the ground will remain frozen and heavy machinery will be able to move on it. Only time will tell whether this is the case or not. With the offensive ongoing now for the better part of 4 months, it's important to take stock of what it has achieved. First, let us stress that nobody has seen a near-peer conflict between two semi-modern powers in decades, and that nobody, including us, can claim to know exactly how the war will unfold. It is counterproductive to try to put a timetable on Ukraine's armed forces, but they are not going to give up without a fight. Even if the advance along the Robotyne axis stagnates, Ukraine will remain committed to what could potentially turn into a decades-long guerrilla war. Even this would not eliminate them from victory contention. Look at what happened to the Russians in Afghanistan. Still, over the past 4 months, Ukraine has managed to retake half the territory Russia captured earlier this year, pierced Russia's vaunted Surovikin line of defense, threatened Russian logistics by striking deep into Crimea, and deprived Russia control of the Western Black Sea. These are not insignificant gains. And yet, the expected breakthrough still hasn't materialized. And it's honestly not all that hard to see why. Ukraine spent weeks probing for weaknesses along the front lines, but by the time they were ready to mass and exploit any of them, they discovered that they critically lacked Western mine clearing and engineering support vehicles, which would enable safe passage through the defensive quagmire. To adapt, they had individual soldiers crawling forward with minesweepers under small arms fire, mortars, and artillery rounds to chart the path ahead, with predictably slow results. In addition, nobody expected Russia to recommit its dwindling force of attack helicopters into the midsummer crucible, but this they did, achieving limited successes against the onrushing pockets of Leopard and Bradley fighting vehicles as Ukraine suffered from a lack of mobile air defenses. Still, by mid-August there was visual confirmation of Russia losing its 40th Ka-52, with more losses reported. Russia had inflicted significant damage on Ukraine's advancing columns, but only at a serious cost to its own combat capabilities. This then encouraged Ukraine to change its tactics yet again. Rather than probe enemy defenses in the hopes of throwing their weight at the critical point and causing a complete Russian collapse, they started to focus on the long term. Russian artillery units were accustomed to engaging in artillery duels with enemy troops as their troops advanced. Pretty soon, however, they began noticing the enemy's guns falling silent. Ukrainian gunners only responded when its forces came under Russian artillery fire, and they did so with precision radar and counter-battery fires, specifically targeting and destroying Russian artillery emplacements. This has served to shrink the gap in Russia's biggest advantage of the entire war thus far, its disproportionate quantity of available artillery. Russia remains invested in destroying the ever-elusive HIMARS batteries, wreaking havoc among artillery of their own. With an influx of even more units donated to the Ukrainian armed forces, Russian assets remain almost as vulnerable as they were when the weapon system first arrived on the battlefield. We know this is a critical problem for Russian forces. Last July, they even fired one of their own generals, commander of the 52nd Combined Arms Army, for complaining that the Russian Ministry of Defense was failing its troops. There was, he said, scant reconnaissance or protection for Russian artillery, which proved to be increasingly vulnerable to Ukrainian strikes. The ongoing destruction of Russian artillery remains a core objective for Ukrainian forces. It has and will continue to severely limit Russia's ability to conduct meaningful offensive operations of its own. Add to this the calculated targeting of Russia's high command in Ukraine, and you start to see what they are building at. If they can attrit Russian leadership, destroy expensive air defenses, missiles, radars with small-scale raids, and wreak havoc among Russian artillery batteries, its troops will lose confidence in their leaders, introducing new weaknesses in Russia's ongoing quest to maintain command and control on the battlefield. Yes, Ukraine may not be on the cusp of the breakthrough many Westerners anticipated at the start of last summer, but it is far from losing ground. But what do you think? Will this underdog come out on top and over time send Putin's army running for the hills? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.